Engineers in California this morning are struggling to develop a plan to remove huge amounts of debris after a devastating landslide.
The landslide that has closed this scenic road is a monster that is still growing.
It didn't begin with a warning siren or a long buildup. It began with the ground giving up. Drivers along California's coastal highways felt the road shudder for a split second before it simply disappeared. Pavement cracked open, guardrails twisted, and entire sections of roadways slid straight into the ocean. In some places, the collapse happened so fast that cars were left stranded just feet from open water. Along cliffside neighborhoods, the failure was even more terrifying. Backyards that had existed for decades suddenly dropped away. Homes tilted forward as the earth beneath them fractured, sending chunks of land tumbling into the surf below. Power lines snapped, streetlights flickered, then went dark. Sirens cut through the fog as emergency alerts flooded phones across coastal towns. Evacuation orders spread block by block. Families rushed uphill, grabbing whatever they could carry, turning back only long enough to watch drone footage of their own streets breaking apart in real time. There was no gradual erosion, no visible warning signs, just solid ground one moment and open ocean the next. Helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting images of neighborhoods that no longer matched their maps. Roads ended mid-intersection. Entire lanes were gone. What had been familiar just hours earlier was suddenly unrecognizable. And as the scale of the collapse became clear, one unsettling question spread faster than the evacuation orders themselves. How could land that was supposed to be stable fail this suddenly? Because what caused this wasn't obvious yet, and the real reason was still hidden beneath the surface. At first, the explanation seemed obvious: a powerful storm, massive waves, and unlucky timing of tides. But within hours, scientists knew that story didn't hold up. Wave sensors along the coast began reporting numbers that didn't fit historical patterns. These weren't just strong waves, they were carrying far more energy than storms of similar strength had ever produced. Entire seawalls, designed to withstand once-in-a-generation events, failed in a single tide cycle. Engineers watched live data in disbelief. Protective dunes vanished almost instantly. Barriers meant to slow flooding were overtopped as if they weren't there at all. Even newly reinforced sections of coastline gave way without resistance. King tides made the situation worse. These extreme tidal events, caused by the alignment of the sun and moon, normally create minor flooding, but this time they arrived stacked on top of storm surge and record wave height, pushing water far beyond anything coastal defenses were built to handle. Still, something didn't add up. Storms pass, tides recede, yet the land itself wasn't bouncing back. Instead of temporary flooding, entire sections of the coast had permanently dropped. Roads didn't just flood, they fractured. Cliffs didn't erode, they collapsed outright. That's when experts realized that danger wasn't coming only from the ocean. The ground itself had been compromised long before the first wave hit, and that hidden weakness was about to change how scientists understood California's coastline forever. For years, the coastline had been moving, just not in a way anyone could see. Not sliding, not cracking, sinking. Scientists now confirmed what most Californians never suspected. Large stretches of the coast had been slowly subsiding, dropping millimeter by millimeter each year. Too subtle to feel, too gradual to trigger alarms, but relentless. Satellite measurements and GPS stations told the story clearly. Areas that looked solid on the surface were measurably lower than they had been a decade earlier. The land wasn't eroding away, it was settling downward, like a platform losing its supports. Engineers had built seawalls, highways, and neighborhoods assuming one critical thing: that the ground beneath them was stable. That assumption quietly failed. Experts began describing the process as a slow-motion earthquake. No shaking, no sound, just a steady loss of elevation that weakened everything built on top of it. When the storm arrived, it didn't have to fight the coastline. The land had already stepped back. That's why the collapse felt so sudden. The damage didn't start with the waves. By the time the ocean surged inland, the coast was already lower, already vulnerable, already primed to give way. Seawalls met water higher than they were designed for. Cliffs exposed to wave force at their weakest points. What looked like a single catastrophic moment was actually years in the making. And subsidence wasn't acting alone, because at the same time the land was sinking, the ocean itself was growing more powerful, setting the stage for something even more destructive. While the ground was quietly sinking, the ocean was changing in a far more violent way. Scientists tracking offshore conditions noticed noticed something unprecedented. The Pacific wasn't just producing bigger storms, it was storing more energy than ever before. Vast marine heat waves had spread along the west coast, warming surface waters across hundreds of miles. That warmth acted like fuel. Storm systems that once weakened as they approached California now intensified instead. Each low-pressure system pulled more moisture, more winds, and more force from the heated ocean below. The result was wave after wave, carrying far more power than coastal defenses were designed to absorb. Deep ocean buoys recorded swells reaching extreme heights offshore. As those waves moved toward land, dropping air pressure caused them to grow even taller. By the time they slammed into the coast, they weren't just breaking, they were detonating. And unlike past storms, there was no recovery window. Normally, the coastline absorbs damage, then stabilizes. This time, storms arrived in rapid succession. Before sand could settle or cliffs could dry, another surge followed, stacking force on top of weakness. With subsiding land lowering the shoreline and supercharged waves pushing higher, the ocean suddenly reached places it had never touched before. The coast wasn't being tested, it was being overwhelmed, and the most destructive phase of the collapse was still invisible, happening below the waterline, where no one could see it coming. What finally broke the coastline didn't happen where anyone was watching. Beneath the surface, relentless waves began attacking the land from below. Each surge slammed into the base of cliffs and seawalls, carving away support that had held for decades. This process, known to geologists as undercutting, doesn't announce itself. It works silently, steadily, until gravity takes over. As storm-driven waves reached higher than ever before, they struck parts of the coastline that were never meant to be exposed. With the land already sinking, water found new angles of attack, eroding foundations that had once sat safely above the tide. From above, everything looked intact until it wasn't. Entire sections of cliff collapsed without warning, shearing away in massive slabs. Seawalls failed not from overtopping, but from having nothing left beneath them. Roads cracked as the ground below hollowed out, leaving thin layers of asphalt suspended over empty space. Sensor networks installed to monitor stability began dropping offline. Some were crushed under falling debris. Others were drowned by salt water. Live data feeds flickered and vanished just as the collapse accelerated. Once undercutting reached a critical point, failure became inevitable. And with every collapse along the shore, the danger didn't just move sideways, it moved inland because the ocean had opened the door, and water was about to push much farther than anyone expected. Once the coastline failed, the danger didn't stop at the water's edge. Floodwaters surged inland through breaches that hadn't existed hours earlier. Streets became channels. Intersections filled from below as ocean water pushed backward through storm drains and sewer systems, reversing flows designed to move in the opposite direction. At the same time, relentless rains soaked hillsides already weakened by rising groundwater. Soil that had absorbed too much water began to lose cohesion. Slopes that had stood firm for generations started to creep and slide. Entire neighborhoods were suddenly trapped between two threats: water advancing from the coast, land giving way from behind. Emergency officials expanded evacuation zones to areas never classified as coastal risk. Families who thought they were safely inland were ordered out, not because of waves, but because the ground beneath their homes was no longer stable. In some regions, rivers backed up as tides pinned them shut, forcing floodwaters to spill sideways into communities instead of draining out to sea. What should have been a release became a bottleneck, sending water uphill and undermining foundations block by block. Experts called it a compound disaster, multiple hazards stacking together, each one accelerating the next. Flooding weakened soil. Saturated ground triggered landslides. Landslides redirected water into new paths, creating fresh zones of collapse. This wasn't a single emergency. It was a cascading failure, spreading faster than response teams could keep up. And as evacuation routes disappeared and communications faltered, a new problem emerged. California's infrastructure was beginning to fail right alongside the land itself. As the land continued to give way, California's critical systems followed. Power substations along the coast were among the first to fail. Salt water flooded electrical equipment, forcing emergency shutdowns to prevent fires and electrocution. Rolling blackouts spread rapidly, plunging hundreds of thousands of homes into darkness just as evacuation orders intensified. Communication fractured next. Cell towers lost power or were physically damaged, leaving entire cities cut off from mobile alerts. Emergency agencies reverted to radio broadcasts and loudspeakers, trying to reach residents who no longer had reliable service. Transportation networks collapsed almost simultaneously. State Route 1, already weakened, became impassable impassable across multiple counties. Bridges designed to withstand earthquakes were never meant to endure prolonged submersion and shifting foundations. Some were closed, others simply disappeared beneath the water. Rescue teams were forced to improvise. Helicopters airlifted the most vulnerable. Boats navigated streets that had been dry the day before. In isolated pockets, first responders reached residents by foot, crossing unfamiliar terrain where roads no longer existed. At emergency command centers, officials confronted an uncomfortable truth. These systems were engineered for a coastline assumed to be stable. Disaster plans were built around predictable threats, storms that pass, floods that recede. But this wasn't predictable. The ground itself was changing faster than infrastructure could adapt. Every hour brought new failures. Every fix was temporary. And as night approached, one final realization set in. Even if the storm stopped, the danger wouldn't, because the coastline itself had crossed the threshold it couldn't return from. By the time the winds eased, the crisis was far from over. Each new tide brought fresh collapse. Areas that appeared stable at sunrise failed by afternoon. Satellite images updated faster than officials could respond, showing beaches narrowed to thin strips and entire blocks erased between passes. Scientists stopped calling it an emergency and started calling it a transformation. The California coastline, long treated as fixed and predictable, was revealed as something else entirely, a living boundary, constantly shifting, retreating, and reshaping itself. Flood maps no longer matched reality. Safe zones became temporary suggestions rather than guarantees. Engineers acknowledged that some neighborhoods may never be rebuilt, not because recovery is impossible, but because rebuilding assumes permanence, and permanence is no longer assured. Sandbags and reinforced walls might slow the loss, but they can't stop a coastline that's actively moving. The deeper lesson was impossible to ignore. This wasn't an outlier event. It was a preview. Marine heat waves, sinking land, and intensified storms are no longer rare coincidences. Together, they define a new baseline, one where even moderate events can trigger massive consequences. As night settled over the battered coast, emergency crews continued working, even as their own stations flooded. Residents returning to assess damage found something more unsettling than destruction. Familiar boundaries were gone. Streets had become inlets. Landmarks no longer lined up with memory. The question facing California now isn't how to restore the past. It's how to live with a future where the edge of land can shift overnight, because the next storm is already forming. The next high tide is only hours away. And in a landscape that refuses to stand still, vigilance isn't optional. It's survival.